After a few days' rest, my wounds were healed and I was transferred, as I had requested, to the Unicorn Front. It took a few days to travel from the north of the Scarlet Empire border to the border on the southwest. While in transit, various convoys merged with our own. Apparently, a lot of troops along the northern Pegasi front were transferred by force. Some other smaller convoys also came from the eastern front against the Moon Kingdom. Its queen, Waning, had apparently a fierce leader, and her generals equally so. However, she also deplores unnecessary violence, and as such has reached out with peace to her neighbors. The Scarlet Empire remembers what the Moon Kingdom, and especially Waning, did for it in the past when the plague threatened to destroy everyone here. And since we are facing war with each of our borders, agreeing to this armistice was an easy decision to make. However, her other neighbors aren't so noble as to show appreciation for what she had done in the past. In the end, only we accepted her truce. We soon reached the Unicorn Front, but it was not what I was expecting. The entire area was a charred, partially burned wasteland, with our tents pitched up in the midst of it. We were outside of a recently taken Unicorn City, whose name I do not know. However, the general later told me that he has taken to renaming all Unicorn Cities that they capture, and this one he named Scarlet Hoof. He went on to explain how it resembled how the Scarlet Empire was going to crush the magical symposium under its hoof. As the newest additions to the combat here and I arrived, we were corralled into a large open area with what looked like a stage in front of us. As an officer, I was told to stand at the front, and did so as the rest of the newcomers arrived. Soon, roughly 100 ponies were gathered before the stage. Only 3 others stood alongside me, my fellow officers. A few minutes passed before 3 ponies trotted on stage. One stood at the podium in the center, while the other 2 stood at attention beside him. The one at the podium began to speak. "Welcome to the fight, every pony. Allow me to introduce myself. I am General Bloodhoof, and I lead the fight against the Unicorn Menace, and those 2 here assisting me in doing so. To my right is Brigadier General Forge, and to my left is Colonel Gizmo. Now, with that out of the way, let me say right now, the fighting here is unlike anything you have faced before. The unicorns are brutal, bloodthirsty, and will stop at nothing to eradicate us inferior ponies. Now, I know some of you are unicorns yourselves. Well, let me tell you that they hate you just as much as any pony else. If you do so much as look kindly at a non-unicorn, you are committing treason in their eyes. They are an idealistic group who believes that the unicorns are the supreme beings in this world. Unicorns do have their strong points. Those of you who are fighting with us, I'm glad to have. But the supreme beings? I have 2 words to say to that. Horseshit. Enough on that matter, however. We are here to fight, not talk. I run things very differently than the other generals. I need to. Things here get messy, and I do ensure my troops can, and will, do their best. Your past generals probably just gave you orders while sitting in some HQ, am I right? Well, fuck those cowards. I fight with you. I lead charges. I strike the enemy first, and as such, I will need to rely on you at all times. If I cannot expect myself to do as I command, how can I expect all of you to follow my orders? And you will follow my orders. I can be a kind leader, or a cruel tyrant, all depending upon how you carry yourselves. And I have 0 tolerance for traitorous acts, including aiding the enemy, fleeing from the enemy without command, and just downright cowardice. I treat traitors one way. I send them home. In a casket. And on that note, send up the traitors. At the general's word, 2 ponies were led to the stage, 1 unicorn and 1 earth pony. The unicorn looks like they have given up all hope. However, the earth pony still has fire in his eyes. That is bullshit, General! You know it is! He spat at the general. The general smiled and said, Gag him. One of the soldiers escorting the traitors moved to put a muzzle over his mouth, but the earth pony got some words in beforehand. Don't let the general fool you! We did what was right! Don't... But he was cut off as the soldier slipped the muzzle on, and the general began to speak once again. I'm sure many of you have noticed the charred and burning state of the land around us. That is due to the tactic that we use to weaken our enemy. We simply set fire to the surrounding countryside of a town, burning all the houses and crops that could aid the enemy. During this tactic, it is not rare for enemy soldiers to get caught in the fires and burn alive. It is acceptable, and I welcome their deaths to the flames of war. One less unicorn to fight, right? Well, these 2 took it upon themselves to attempt and rescue a small group of unicorn combatants from being burned alive in a house. They succeeded, and the unicorns fled back into the city we later took. Because of the actions of these 2 ponies before you, more of our brothers had to die in combat at the hooves of those who should have been dead. These 2 are just as guilty as the enemy is, and for that, they will be executed. The general unsheathed his sword and turns toward the unicorn before slashing his throat, and then the earth ponies. He then stabs his sword into the stage and turns back to face us. These traitors made a mockery of our great army. If it was up to me, it would be my pleasure to execute every traitor we come across. However, I have my hands full fighting on the front lines, defending our homes. If you all obey orders and fight to your fullest, we won't have any problems. Fight with me, and you will quickly become seasoned veterans, and maybe even go on to earn yourselves a promotion or 2. I look forward to fighting with you all in defense of our great empire. That is all. Go and find your assignments. Officers, report to the command tent. With that, he turned. As the brigadier general and colonel, and the 3 of them walked off the stage, heading for what I assume is the command tent. On stage, the soldiers that escorted the traitors up were now hauling off their bodies, and a new soldier galloped up to retrieve the general's sword. Around me, murmurs could be heard as every pony talked amongst themselves. I was uncertain of how to interpret what I had just seen. The general certainly seemed cruel, but maybe he was just putting on an act in front of the new troops. One thing was certain. My time here was going to be interesting. An entire month had gone by since I arrived at the Unicorn Front. Soldiers had perished and new ones had come to replace them. The general was right. This front was unlike the others. It was gory, taxing, and deadly. And sure, all war was like that, but this is something else. In my time here, I came to think of General Bloodhoof as a kind leader. He expects nothing of his soldiers that he himself doesn't expect of himself. And as he said, he fights in the front. His many scars on his ember coat are proof enough of that. It would also appear as he has taken a liking to me, having me lead important missions and diversions. In this month, we have fought only 2 battles, but they were both taxing, and we lost many soldiers. And somehow, through that, I managed to gain 2 promotions. And only the first one was due to a death. I am now a major. The general thinks that with my help, we can end the war with the unicorns within a year. And he has already told me that if I keep this up, more promotions will be ahead. At the moment, however, there is a lull in the fighting, Even the best oiled fighting machine needs to rest. And since my wife is due to have a child in less than a month, this is a good time as any to ask for leave. I make my way to the command tent and talk with the general. As I enter through the tent, I see the tent is empty, aside from the general and the brigadier general. Know that things have been progressing roughly at best, and every step forward is met with heavy resistance. I hear the East is sending us more troops, thanks to the armistice, but the North and South have none to spare. Fighting in the South is almost as bad there as it is here, and the North still needs some troops to defend in case of Pegasi counterattack. We must make do with what we have for now. The brigadier general was informing the general, but the general just slammed his hoof down. Other fronts are nothing compared to our fighting force. If I were in their position of leadership, I would have finished long ago and sent aid to another. We have taken all the smaller towns we can. Our next siege must be their fortress. But with what we have, it'll be very deadly. I stepped up to the table. Sorry to interrupt, General. I have a favor to ask. The general looked my way before saying flatly, "What is it, Major Crimson?" He wasn't in a good mood, but I pressed on. "General, you see, my wife is pregnant and due in less than a month. I would like leave so that I could be with her when it happens, sir." The general seemed to grimace when I asked for leave. "There is no doubt in my mind that you have earned leave, but at this time, on the precipice of a siege on a fortress, I'm not sure we can handle your absence." The brigadier general chimed in. "Oh, come on, General. He's having a kid. Crimson, is this your first?" I nodded. "His first kid? Come on, General. He'll be back before we know it. And what's more, he will come back refreshed and ready for action." The general looked at him, to me, and finally at the map that lay open on the table. He sighed before saying, "I will consider it. Return here tomorrow at this time, and I'll have an answer for you." My face immediately lit up as hope soared through my mind. "Thank you, sir. I'll see you then." I then left the tent, heading for my own. Brigadier General Forge turned to General Bloodhoof. "Oh, you're actually going to consider allowing our up-and-coming officer to go on leave before a fortress siege?" Bloodhoof smiled. "Of course. He deserves leave, after all. Of all our soldiers under my command, he has fought the hardest. And even if he decides to take his leave, he won't be gone long. He'll be back before we know it." Forge raised an eyebrow. "Do you think he loves war that much?" Bloodhoof shook his head. "No, I don't think he does. But he seems drawn to war. It suits him. Perhaps he has what it takes to be a great general someday. That is, of course, if he can focus on military duty and forgets about being a devoted father and husband." Forge let out an awkward laugh. "You really can be cruel, can't you, General?" Bloodhoof just grinned. "It comes with the territory of being a general. And I'm not cruel. I simply understand the needs of war. The great Scarlet Empire needs to expand its borders and protect itself from its enemies. Nothing will get in the way of our defense." I had been antsy all day, waiting till the time to hear the general's decision. I would get to go home and see my wife, or would he force me to remain here until after the fortress siege? I arrived shortly before the specified time and waited outside. It wasn't long before the flap of the tent opened and a masked pony with a blood-red cloak walked out. I had never seen one in person, but that pony fits the exact description of the Emperor's elite guard. The wooden mask painted red that keeps the muzzle exposed, and painted with a gold gear over the right eye. The blood-red cloak and the steel halberd. The legends surrounding them say that they only talk to the Emperor and his generals. Perhaps the general is looking for reinforcements while I'm away? But it is almost time for me to hear the general's decision. I enter the command tent as the talking ended once the lead guard left. As I do so, the general notices me. Crimson, right on time. I've considered your request for leave, and I am happy to grant it to you, should you wish to take it. You can leave when you are ready. My eyes widened, and a grin spread across my muzzle. Really, General? Thank you so much. I'll leave tonight, be back as soon as I can. The General smiled. I know you will. However, an elite guard just informed me of something. Apparently, a small group of unicorns have broken through our line and are wreaking havoc on our slimly protected villages. Be careful you do not meet these scum while you're on leave. Now then, go and hurry back. We have a war to finish. I nodded my head, saluted the General, and trotted back to my tent to pack everything I needed. Hold on, honey. I'm on my way home. My home, given to me by my father, who got it from his father who built it. A quaint little hovel on the edge of town. The house that my wife and unborn foal reside in is ablaze with the fires of hell. I got into town at night, but I could only see smoke rising from somewhere. I galloped towards the smoke, only to discover that it was my home ablaze. The fire must only have been started recently, as no pony else had gathered and the alarm had not been raised. As I sprinted towards the door, 4 silhouettes came into view. 4 unicorns, clad in the armor of the magical symposium. Were these the unicorns that the General had spoken of? I swiftly drew my sword and charged at the unicorns. I was upon them in seconds, and before they realized what was happening, I had taken the heads off of 2 of them. The other 2 were quick to respond, but not quick enough as I slit one's throat and stabbed my sword in the other one's chest, and left it there. I bucked open the door of my burning house and charged inside, only to be hit with a wave of heat. I shielded my head with a leg while I looked around the house. It wasn't long before I saw my wife, laying in the middle of it, and ran to her side. As I got closer, I noticed that she had wounds on her sides, but she was still breathing. Barely. I hauled her onto my back and carried her outside as quickly as I was able, staying low to the ground to avoid the smoke. I burst forth from the doorway and into the cool air of the night. A crowd had started to gather, and some guards had been called. I headed a far distance away from the burning house and lay Ivory on the ground. As I did so, I told one of the ponies in the crowd to get a doctor, and I cradled Ivory's head in my hooves. Come on, Ivory. Stay with me. You're going to be fine. The doctor's on his way. Come on, baby, I whispered to her. She was losing a lot of blood, and without aid, she would die soon. Crim? I'm so happy to see you. Ivory's voice was barely audible. No, honey, don't speak. Keep what strength you can, I told her. She gave me a weak smile as she said, I love you, Crimson. After uttering those words, she closed her eyes and didn't open them again. I held her head close to my chest, and I cried into her mane. I was too late. If only I'd been minutes, seconds, faster, getting there, she might not have died. Lost in my mourning, I didn't notice the doctor approach us. Crimson, back up. Give me some room, the doctor said. She's already dead, Doctor. There's nothing you can do, I told him. I can see that, he said. But if we act quickly, we might be able to save your foal. Upon those words, I immediately lay Ivory's head down and gave the doctor some room. Please, Doctor, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. The doctor cut open Ivory's abdomen to gain access to her uterus, and within minutes, he pulled our foal from my wife's body. I looked at the doctor, smiled, and asked, Well, Doctor, do I have a colt or a filly? Immediately after asking, my smile disappeared. The doctor wasn't smiling. He looked grim. He looked at me and said, Crimson, I'm sorry. But your colt didn't make it. I fell to the ground in utter disbelief. A colt. We could have had a colt, Ivory. Thank you, Doctor, but I'd like to be left alone for a while. The doctor nodded and laid my colt's body next to its mother before he left. I sat there, next to their bodies, for what seemed like hours. The following morning, I had a lot of business to attend to. Ivory's body had been taken to the undertaker's the previous night, along with our colts, who I decided to name Cenarius, because his colt was a coppery gray color. We were going to be holding a funeral tomorrow for the both of them. I had to go through the process of picking out their grave plots and coffins. I also had to inform the guards of what I encountered and hire some pony to clear the wreckage of my home, which had completely burned down. I had nothing left in this town to call my own. The fire and those unicorns saw to that. I decided to sell my land my house was on, and to dedicate the rest of my able-bodied life to destroying the unicorn bastards who caused the death of the ones I loved. I wouldn't become rich from fighting in the military, but when I can no longer fight, I will have enough money set aside to buy a house to live out the rest of my days. I won't be a happy or easy life from now on, but if I can prevent another innocent death, prevent some pony's wife and foal from being killed, it will be worth it. The day following the death of my wife was a day full of sorrowful looks, words of sympathy, and acts of pity. At one point, I wandered into an alley just to get away from every pony looking at me. I curled up in that alley for a few hours before carrying on with my business. When I finally returned to the room I was renting, I couldn't even sleep. The night passed by me as I lay on the bed. My mind was filled with thoughts of my wife, Colt, and the life that we could have had together. When the next morning finally rolled around, I was thankful to see the sunrise. Today was the day of the funeral, the last time I would see my wife's or Colt's body. I prepared myself and made my way to the graveyard. No one else was there. It was far too early for the funeral, but I had nothing else to do, and I really didn't want to be alone in my room the whole day. I stood before the dug graves and waited, lost in my own thoughts. After quite some time, the funeral assembled around me. I returned back to reality for the duration of the funeral, and hearing every pony's kind words to give me their condolences. The coffins of my wife and Colt were lowered into the ground, their graves about a foot from each other, and buried. Words were said, shoulders were patted, but the whole thing just passed like a blur. Like it had appeared, the funeral slowly disappeared around me as I stood before the two fresh graves. The sun began to set, and I turned from the graves to return to my room. I had nothing keeping me in town any longer. The next morning, I would return to fight against the unicorns. I promised myself that I would return to my family's graves again, once the unicorn menace had been crushed. They killed my family. And now I will not rest till their armies lay in shambles.